U.S. Representative Andy Levin joining us on the Oakland County Megacast once again. Representative Levin, thank you for being with us today.
Hey, Tyler, it's so great to hear your voice, and I'm really glad to be on Megacast.
Yeah, good to have you back. Since we last spoke, how have you been? How has your team been?
Oh, thanks for asking. My family's good. We're trying to stay safe, and there's a big silver lining in having more kids home than we ever expected to have. Again, living at home because of the COVID-19 crisis. But it sure is a devastating situation for our nation. It's
It
just
absolutely is. And you mentioned having kids back at home. A lot of families are preparing to return their kids to school in the coming weeks as the fall semester begins. Some schools planning to be entirely in person, some planning a hybrid method of in person and virtual. Some have decided to remain entirely virtual for the foreseeable future. You recently co-signed a letter with the Michigan delegation to U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos to stop her from diverting federal CARES Act monies from public schools to private schools. Could you explain a little bit about that, as Michigan did, of course, join 4 other states in a lawsuit against the Secretary of Education for this similar issue, and explain what was going on, what the letter from yourself and the rest of the Michigan delegation that had signed it was about, that you sent to U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos.
Sure. Well, you know, Secretary DeVos, for many, many years, long before she became Secretary of Education, her life mission has really been to undermine universal public education in America. And she worked on that in Michigan, and now she's trying to make that happen for the whole country. And she's perfectly entitled to her own views and her, own advocacy. But now she runs the U.S. Department of Education, and her job is to put into practice laws that Congress passes. We passed the CARES Act that provided funds for public schools, as the federal government does, and specifically really for poor kids, districts with more kids in poverty, English language learners, kids with learning disabilities. And what she did here is she simply took money that in the pandemic, Congress very clearly designated for public schools. And as I mentioned, really trying to help those most affected by the crisis. And she said, well, I'm just going to divert a significant amount of this money to private schools. And the thing that's probably most shocking about it, Tyler, is not even based on any of the metrics we had for the public schools. So the most wealthy private schools would get money on an equal basis with poor kids and our poorest, Mount Clemens or Pontiac or whatever our poor public school districts are here. It's just outrageous. And so it violates the letter and the intent of Congress, of the CARES Act that we passed. And so we're telling her, you just can't do that.
So, with that situation being what it is, where does that money go? Is that being decided by the U.S. Secretary of Education? Is that being decided by the United States Congress in the Senate in their passing of the Federal CARES Act? Or is that a crisis where that money is being kind of pulled one way and pulled the other by either side, and we could have a situation where these schools are getting those funds on a delayed basis? What's the status of these Federal CARES Act dollars going to our public schools?
Well, we have a whole nother problem with the education department about how slow they've been. But, our Constitution is pretty clear and fantastic. We have the Article 1 body, the U.S. Congress, the House and the Senate, that passes laws. We have the power of the purse. We decide where money should be spent. And then we have the Article 2 body, the executive branch, the president and all of his appointees and employees who carry it out. And we're having, I would say, greater problems with this administration in carrying out what Congress passes. In other words, in the past, even if there's Democrats and Republicans and we tussle over what the best policy is, once Congress passes something, the administration, carries it out. And here, the administration is trying to divert the money. So she's moving forward with her plan. We're telling her it's not acceptable. And as you mentioned, a number of states are suing her because they also believe attorneys general from a number of states are suing her because they believe that she's violating the CARES Act. But this is part of a larger situation where we have to decide what to do about public education or all schools in the fall, and that's even a much bigger problem because the House 11 weeks ago passed the HEROES Act, which provided another $56 billion just for K-12, about $90 billion overall for education from pre-K to universities. And then we also passed the Moving Forward Act, our big infrastructure bill that provides $250 billion for schools, which desperately need to do things like improve their HVAC systems, their heating and cooling systems to have better air filtration to deal with COVID. And the Senate, isn't doing anything on these matters. What they've proposed only in the last few days is, a fraction of what we intended. And plus, as you've seen, the president and Secretary DeVos are shouting from rooftops, open schools no matter what, just open. And they're trying to condition funding, Tyler, on schools reopening fully, like basically blackmail. We'll provide federal funding, but you won't really get your share unless you open fully. And that, you can't do that in a public health emergency. I mean, that's just outrageous. What if one community has mass community spread of COVID going on and another community or state in another part of the country is in great shape? The idea that they both should do the same thing, no epidemiologist would say that. This is so far above political party, Tyler. Let's just be guided by science and doctors. That's what I say.
For parents who are struggling to make these decisions about their kids going back to school in the fall, what advice are you giving to parents with the child care issue? That's another glaring light that is coming out of this.
Yeah, well, it's really a big problem. And we also provided a lot of funding for childcare in the HEROES Act that also is not in what the Senate has proposed. So we're really negotiating to try to make, have a relief package that actually works for the American people. I mean, I think every family has to decide for themselves based on what are the parents' health conditions. Are there grandparents or other adults involved? The whole thing about both childcare and public schools or all schools is that you're bringing together people, kids, but also teachers and other staff for, how they say you shouldn't be within 6 feet of someone for 5 or 10 minutes. People are there for 6 hours, 8 hours a day with all this mixing going on. And so it's a real problem for families that have, maybe older folks or people with pre-existing conditions in the household. And then the availability of childcare is another huge problem. It's we need to devote a lot more resources to it than we have, and that's what I'm fighting to do. But so far, the Senate hasn't agreed to do it.
U.S. Representative Andy Levin with us on the Oakland County Megacast all throughout the local area on television, on the radio, and on other media outlets such as Facebook via Facebook Live. Representative Levin, as we continue to see this battle between the House of Representatives and their HEROES Act and the Republicans in the Senate and their HEALS Act, we are having that negotiation, that tug and pull one way or the other. But these funds for a lot of states and municipalities are needed as soon as possible. In some cases, these funds for programs for municipalities and so on were needed yesterday. And we're hearing yesterday we heard from Senator Chuck Schumer as well as the President's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, that those negotiations are making some progress. They're moving forward, but they're still a ways away from any fruitful completion that gets the second supplemental ready to go, ready to be passed, and ultimately the money to be distributed to these different resources. How far away do you presume that we are from an agreement being made, from compromise being made in Washington on this clearly necessary funding that needs to go to the states, to these municipalities, to these various programs, etc.
Well, Tyler, let me say two different things about that. One is to sort of try to answer your question directly. They have now dug into kind of an issue by issue negotiation, which should have happened. You know, we passed the HEROES Act on May 15th. 65,000 Americans have died of COVID, formally recorded as dying of COVID since then. And the Senate, is only now acted. So this should have been going on months ago. But I just want to, I'm afraid I totally agree with your premise, but the Republicans do not. You say this aid for local governments is so needed. The HEALS Act has $0 and 0 cents for state and local governments. The HEROES Act, our bill, had $915 billion for state governments, counties, cities, and townships, and villages, and tribal and territorial governments like, Puerto Rico or the Marianas or whatever. But in terms of Michigan, the HEROES Act would give the state of Michigan over $7 billion in 2020 and over $6 billion in 2021, plus aid to every local government. And we know here, if you go back to the K-12 discussion, I mean, how much of the K-12 budget comes from the state? A lot of it. And if we pass the HEROES Act funding, this Michigan has said so far their deficit from this COVID disaster is about $6.5 billion. So the $7 billion we would provide in 2020 would pretty much keep Michigan in good shape and prevent them from having to slash the budget of K-12 and universities, and so many other things. So just to give you a few examples of the differences, the HEROES Act has $13 an hour hazard pay for essential workers. There's no hazard pay in the HEALS Act. The HEROES Act has up to $6,000 for families of stimulus payments. The HEALS Act just has $1,200 per tax filer. Then there's the state and local funding I mentioned. The HEROES Act extends all the unemployment benefits, including the extra $600 a week, through January 31st. The HEALS Act gives $200 a week through October 5th, and then a very complicated formula that the states won't be able to implement after that. Something we haven't even mentioned, we have $75 billion in the HEROES Act for testing, contact tracing, and supported isolation, plus language from my Coronavirus Containment Corps Act, or CCC Act, to actually set up a contact tracing workforce. Our Governor Whitmer's had to try to do this with volunteers. I mean, and the HEALS Act has $16 billion, so a fraction of the money, and no language requiring the CDC to get moving on a national contact tracing program. There are really big differences. We have the best negotiator on the planet, Nancy Pelosi, working with the Senate and the White House. And, we're pushing very hard to have something closer to what we passed than what the Senate passed. Tyler, let me just say this, we saw the report last week that the second quarter marked by far the greatest contraction of our economy in one quarter in the recorded history of our economy since before World War II. And it's probably a bigger contraction than any quarter during the Great Depression. We've got to get out of our little political bubbles and our little ideologies and step up to the plate and do what's necessary to, as Ronnie said, I think, keep, have childcare there for people who have to go to work. Give people enough money that they can make their car payment, their rent, whatever. We're going to have mass hunger, mass evictions, people losing their homes, because they can't pay their mortgage unless we help. And the thing that people have to realize is the deficit and all those problems would get way worse if we don't help people now, because we'll have a structural disaster in the economy for at least several years if we don't help people get through this.
This virus does not know boundaries, does not know state lines, does not know politics. Should there be a national response to try to contain it?
You are so right. I think it was in March that I started calling for Donald Trump to use the full powers of the Defense Production Act to say, look, we won World War II by coming together and making everything we needed. And of course, our Detroit played a huge role in that, the arsenal of democracy. Now we're facing the biggest public health crisis in a century, and we need to do everything we can. So he should have said, we're going to procure or make everything we need for testing, which we still haven't done, everything we need for protection, personal protective equipment, the famous PPE, which we still haven't done, and everything we need for treatment, from ventilators and medicines up to a vaccine. And we still haven't done that. The thing is, Ronnie, it's so patriotic, right? We already have this Defense Production Act law that gives the president the power to give guaranteed contracts to companies to make everything we need with U.S. workers on American soil, rebuilding our economy. And I don't understand why he wouldn't do it, because I think it fits his politics. As you say, this goes above politics. Secondly, in addition to the Defense Production Act, we need to have a public health approach to this. Our country has perhaps had the least competent response to this of any wealthy nation in the world. I'm sorry to say it, but our reproduction rate of the virus, our death rate, however you measure it, is higher than almost any other country in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, whatever. And the reason is just what you say. The president said, the buck stops in Lansing and in Providence, Rhode Island, and in Olympia, Washington, and what are all the state capitals, and let all the mayors and governors duke it out over PPE. No, this is the moment when, for a president to say, okay, we're going to take a public health approach to this. We're going to get this virus's reproduction rate down well below 1. In other words, each person infected infects less than one other person, so that it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And then we're going to have mass testing and contact tracing, so that we know that any little time there's a flare up, we can snuff it out, because we know who's got it, and then we can see who they've been with, warn those people, test those people, help them isolate. And again, Ronnie, I see this as like patriotic. I mean, what the heck? We're talking about putting a couple 100,000 Americans to work as contact tracers. This is something they would never forget. They'd be telling their grandkids, right? Yeah, way back in 2020, I helped beat that famous COVID-19, and then we could put more people to work by saying, hey, a lot of the people that need to quarantine, they may have kids or people at risk in their household or roommates. Let's open some hotels, which are out of commission mostly, to house people, and we'll pay the hotels to be open. The people need to eat. Let's, pay some restaurants to feed them safely. And the public health response could be the tip of the sword of reopening, instead of acting like public health and economic activity are at odds. No, a good public health response is the very basis of reopening the economy safely. Germany's figured that out. New Zealand's figured that out. South Korea's figured that out. Why our president can't figure that out, I don't know. But I'm afraid to say, I'm pretty sure it's the greatest failure of executive function in the modern history of the presidency. Any party, any kind of crisis. And, the American people are paying a horrifying price for it.
U.S. Representative Andy Levin with us on the Oakland County Megacast. Representative Levin, just another couple minutes with you before we got to let you go. Anything else you'd like to touch on today before we say goodbye?
Well, yeah, there's there's a lot else going on, and I just want to say something about a positive thing that happened locally, which is it's sort of like a negative and a positive thing, I guess, Tyler. But we had this 15-year-old girl, African American girl from my home high school, my district. She's a Groves student. People are calling her Grace. And, I think a judge who I understand has a great reputation and, whatever, I think made a huge mistake by, locking her up, putting her in detention because she didn't do her homework. And I just want to say thank you to all of my colleagues in Congress who joined me in making good trouble about this, as John Lewis would say, all the demonstrators and people in the community who creatively raised their voices, went out there. And thank you to the Michigan Court of Appeals for quickly looking at this situation on Friday and saying, in the middle of a pandemic, when the governor has an executive order saying kids should not be incarcerated unless they're an immediate threat to somebody, that this girl belongs home with her mom. And I think that's a great outcome. But it's another lesson for us that systemic racism is, it's not about you being a racist or me being a racist. Take a deep breath, look around. Our whole society is shot through with structures that, hold up white supremacy. And I think that it's to everybody's benefit to look at these things and try to tackle them. So my colleague from Boston, Ayanna Pressley, has been a leader on this. She's a freshman like me, but she's, as I learned because of Grace, Representative Presley's been leading on this when she was in the Boston City Council. And in fact, before even then, she has a bill on this that I've joined on. And I found out that, I'm the vice chair of the House Education and Labor Committee, and we have jurisdiction over juvenile detention. So I'm going to get involved in trying to figure out how to reduce this kind of disproportionate effect of punishment, suspensions, sending kids to juvenile detention that really affects Black kids, kids of color, and Black girls in particular, disproportionately. Congresswoman Presley's bill is called the Ending Pushout Act. And so, I'm really happy that Grace is out, and I got a good lesson in it and from it. And I'm going to, try to step up and advocate for kids like that all across the country.
Representative Levin, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Ronnie. Thanks for all your great work keeping our community informed. I loved your previous segment about people. It's too late to vote. Put your absentee ballot in the mailbox, folks. Take it into your clerk. That was really helpful.